my interest is power exchange.
Yeah.
And
Is there anything wrong with your kink being from trauma? Maybe. I don't know. I don't care. What I remember is like the first major needle scene I did was putting like 60 needles in my master's cock.
Welcome to Can I Be Blunt, where every so often I chat with members of the BDSM community about femdom, DS relationships, fetishes, and kink. I'm Mistress Danielle Blunt, a professional and lifestyle dominatrix with over 14 years of experience. Listen in while I interview my Twitter colleagues, about their thoughts on everything from orgasm control and cuckolding to age play and foot worship. These conversations are raw, intimate, unedited, and personal. And what I mean by that is that I didn't want to spend time editing this into a highly produced show. So, enjoy the authentic and unedited conversation. In the last episode, Fig and I explored some of the intersections of kink, trauma, and therapy while reflecting on our experiences with our old guard training.
right, there's a difference between the like fetishization of submission and like the role play of submission for a scene and like the role play of so many of these things, or just like the fetish and like the kink of it. And then there is of having that actual power exchange where there has to be space for someone to fuck up too. And I think the issue with our house is that there was no accountability and you were punished anytime you brought something up or ostracized.
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing is like when we think about restorative justice and like abolitionist politic within kink and sexuality, like how do we talk about this, removal of blame when it comes to when something goes wrong in a scene and like trusting that we stay in relationship, that when something goes wrong, it's not necessarily like it's your fault or it's my fault, but this co-created layers of consent and collaboration where we ran into something together that we didn't know happened and it was violating and it was hard, right? And how do we do that part, but also do the very important part of taking accountability when stuff goes wrong?
Yeah. And not being super defensive.
Yeah. And I think we need to have both. And sometimes I think, I sometimes talk to people about those types of dynamics. And for some folks, especially folks who are like, like sexual assault survivors who want to be abolitionists, but have a really hard time with the question of what do we do with the rapists, right? Like this piece of it is really, really hard for them. Like, how do we hold taking accountability and dealing with the real harm that happens, and also playing in a way where there's so much risk of harm and violation happening, and also like not jumping to blame and fault when that happens.
And it also like happens in any relationship. I always try and bring this up too when having these conversations. It doesn't have to be a DS dynamic. All intimacy is risky. All intimacy risks something being unearthed in you that like someone mirrors back or like lifts the veil of something you've been obscuring to yourself and sees you and you see yourself in a way that is incredibly jarring and incredibly intimate and feels incredibly vulnerable and like terrifying and potentially like I don't know if like deregulating is the right word, but like upsetting in a way where risk present in every relationship, any intimate relationship is risky because, and I think Avi really like touches on it because of that opacity of the self. All intimacy, all others that we encounter, we risk, it's kind of like a humiliation session. Like, I'm like, my style of humiliation is I'm just going to hold up the mirror. Like, you humiliate yourself. Humiliating is like existing is humiliating enough. Like, I don't need to do anything. But, it's that opacity, that like lifting the veil that I think is risky. And then when you layer that onto like edge play and you layer that onto like the potentiality of something physically also going a little bit further than you wanted rather than just emotionally, I think it does become riskier. But I do feel like, it's present in any relationship where vulnerability is.
Yeah, I think that's really true too. I think we do forget about that sometimes, or we put the blame on the practice that like kink and BDSM is the problem when I don't think it is. I think it's just like humans relating. There's the risk there. Which, I think there's a reason why I feel so firmly grounded in anti-carceral relationship building. I think that's part of how we build a better world and like a more like revolutionary like perspective around lots of things, but particularly like sex and kink and relationships, is because I think there's a lot of beauty in or like a really, really gorgeous generative stuff happens when we allow ourselves to give ourselves over to that overwhelm, right? Which is very much like Avgi's framing in her book that I'm obsessed with. And I am so attracted and drawn to that I am willing to put myself at risk. But
Yeah.
I have to remember that what that means is something could go wrong.
And then there's also go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Just that I like some of that responsibility lays within you and like myself too, of putting, I need to be aware for myself. Like I don't need when I go out for my annual fucking of a cis man to see what will happen, I am assuming some, even if I experience violation, like I don't know, it's very complicated, right? So this has been a very broad conversation. I think it's so interesting to learn more about some of the many overlaps that we have that really make me question nature or nurture,
I know, it's so interesting. There are a lot of things where I'm like, this was innate in me, and then maybe like Ladraman kind of, brought it out for me and form it. I suspect that we had similar leanings beforehand, and then we got shaped in a very similar way.
We were similar clay. We're cut from the same cloth, and then we're molded into the same blanket. I don't know.
Yeah.
Complicated feelings. I'm still processing some of my more complicated feelings about having gotten a lot out of this place that was deeply, deeply problematic. And I'm curious, like, as we're wrapping up the conversation, like, you talked a little bit about what brought you there and what it was like for you there, like why you stayed. But I'm curious, like, what was it that happened that had you leave? I think it feels also just so important to state that part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation with you is that so many people who I know who have had experiences of being trained in some capacity, whether it be like in a dungeon or in an old guard leather space, have had really bad experiences. It's a power dynamic of mentorship that I don't think is talked about a lot as a power dynamic, that it wasn't just the power dynamic of being someone's submissive at this house. It was also the power dynamic of desiring knowledge and wanting to learn and wanting to be good and wanting to have access to this community and this like beautiful space that this transformed into a beautiful space by some of the people and the sheepskins and the fire and the lavender cookies and all of the beautiful food and the wine pairings that you want access to this space. And so I'm curious, like, yeah, I guess I think it's important both I'm interested in where our experiences overlap and diverge, because it sounds like there's a lot of overlap, especially with the ages that we were at. Just that slightly. I was on my way out kind of as you were on your way in. And I know so many people who have had bad mentorship experiences. And I'm curious, when did you realize it was time to leave and what did that look like for you? And as much as you want to share of like, when did you start realizing some of the things that were happening weren't okay?
Totally. Yeah, I really appreciate that question. Like, I think there's a couple things that happened in succession, and I was like, oh gosh, I have to leave. One of them, like, there are a lot of things that happened, actually, I didn't realize I needed to leave until much later. But a few experiences of, like, deep violation that were also tied to me as a tiny baby, like, 20-something-year-old, having to hold so much emotional labor for these much older people in my life, like 50-year-olds who just couldn't handle their fucking shit. And I was forced to be in that place of emotional maturity, which is a pattern that I have experienced my entire life, being like my parents were very emotionally immature, and I, have very strained relationships with them. Like, I went from a house of very emotionally immature adults to more emotionally immature adults, and I didn't realize how much I needed to get out. But after a string of violation and a string of being put in this position of like being the emotional support person when I was like super de-skilled. I had like not even graduated undergrad yet. I didn't know shit, but people, I know one person, one of the people who ran this house often called me an old soul.
Classic for the adultified child.
Exactly. So after all of that, right, the headmistress at the time, who, you know, I had a pretty complicated relationship to in the house, which was no thanks to the headmaster. R definitely made it more complicated in a lot of ways and manipulated us and both
Yeah.
in ways that made it hard for us to connect, I think. But she left and I was still doing pro dom sessions at La Domaine, and I felt really kind of caught in between. And like my master and my mistress had broken up, they were fighting, and I didn't know what to fucking do about it. I was like, oh no, and I'm stuck in this house where I don't have any other access to community or anything like that. And so I stayed also because I wanted to keep doing pro dom sessions. I really liked doing that, and I didn't know how to do it any other way, because again, they teach you how to dom, but they don't um
They
teach you
want
how.
you dependent on their space.
Yes. I don't know how to be a pro dom independently. Had people ask me how to do that, and I had to be like, I have no fucking clue, because
Yeah.
I was not
I was
trained.
very shocked at how much I had to learn when I
Yeah.
left.
Yeah. So I stayed for maybe a month later after my mistress left, but I had realized I had a conversation with R, because one of the violating experiences that we had together is he basically facilitated a situation in which another one of his submissives hurt me really, really badly, like bit me in a way that was really out of anger and really like it sent a shock through my spine. I burst into tears, and we had to do this whole repair process, which I facilitated and led, and had to be the emotionally strong one because she was falling apart, whatever, etc. And after the aftermath of that, maybe a couple months later, I don't know the timeline exactly. I think that's when my mistress left, and that was when I was setting boundaries. Like, I don't want to be bitten anymore. I don't like being bitten. It reminds me of this experience. And Art explicitly said, you can't expect me to remember your boundaries like that. And that was my last conversation with him. And I left then. And I think also what was really key to this is, along with the mistress leaving, I had read the piece that was part of the catalyst of her leaving, talking about this house under like pseudonyms, not naming specifically, but as like a cult space. I was like, oh shit, I can't be complacent in this house anymore that is clearly harming people, including me.
Yeah.
Because I watched other queer trans people get harmed there too. Like, I let people not use my pronouns. I let people misgender me all the time. Like, did so much of the like, it's okay, I can deal with this mistreatment, because what I really need and want is the access to community and the access to knowledge. And it took me so much to remove myself. And then, you know, I did a couple of pro dom sessions under my mistress who had left, who was still doing that, and I had helped her out a little bit more, and she transitioned into doing something else. But then the pandemic hit and everything shut down, and I had to choose between. I mean, I was like, okay, I'm obviously gonna just be a therapist. I can't be a pro dom right
I
now.
like that we're
So
both also COVID cautious, which is
yeah,
another
yeah,
symbol.
yeah.
So, and yeah, it's, which is like, I wonder too, like, it was a very straight household. Like queer things happened sexually,
Mhm.
but I would call it a straight household.
It was a straight household. It was certainly very cis too. Like, I
It-
remember going to this house. I had already started using they them pronouns. I'd been out for 2 years as a non-binary person. I hadn't medically transitioned yet, but I didn't tell anyone that I used they them pronouns until a certain person did a workshop there and asked everyone their pronouns, and I was so nervous. And I was like, I use they them outside of here, and then just like, and then my mistress at the time got so mad at me for not advocating for my pronouns, when in my mind she didn't actually make the space very welcoming for trans people at that time. And, you know, a couple other trans people went in and out, and I don't think, it wasn't horrible all the time, but the environment certainly didn't encourage me to feel like I would be affirmed in my gender. And that's not completely her fault. It's a lot of ours fault, mostly because he's transphobic. But, it wasn't really a queer space.
Yeah, I think about that a lot in regards to the space and the harm that happened in the space. You were saying something about leaving. But yeah, it's just so interesting how our experiences track so much on top of each other. And it's like, I feel some responsibility too. I brought people there who experienced a lot more harm than I did. And like, I feel pretty complicated about it because I didn't know. I didn't understand what I was experiencing at the time as harm. And I've been speaking more about it because I know that people still go there and people still have bad experiences and that they still prey on like vulnerable people and like younger people. And I think it's a deeply problematic space. And the essay that you're talking about, I'll ask if I can link it. It's not named, so I'm not sure if I should name it. I read it and I had never, I think maybe I mentioned this in the beginning, but like the labor analysis, it's a story about someone who comes into the space just to work and is sort of subjected to the high protocol dynamics that were involved in the lifestyle elements of the house and how inappropriate that is for a workspace. And, those things had never really occurred to me because I was never getting paid, like, right? When you talked about how you didn't have to pay to be there, you were the reason that they made money. And so I think this is another thing that I feel incredibly complicated about and still don't totally have language for my experience. I think my class background also buffered me a bit that like I wasn't dependent on the sex work that I was doing at the time for like a primary source of income. So I didn't have that labor analysis and I didn't have the need to be making money. But when I think about the parties, we were the reason the 60 and 80-year-olds were there, So you say like, oh, I didn't have to pay for the training, but it's also like, was what we were doing at those party labor? And if so, that labor was never paid for. I did a lot of things that I would now consider labor that I was never paid for. And it's very, very, it feels very, very complicated. I feel like conflicted about using certain language around it because I know it's different than a lot of people's experiences, but like the labor practices that were outlined so exquisitely in this essay and how horrifying it was to subject someone who just wanted to make money into these humiliating and like high protocol scenarios really, really made me question my own experience of labor at the space and like what labor I was contributing to the space and how I was almost like systematically not taught about labor at a space that was training me to be a dom and also to work, but never gave me work opportunities. One of the ways they would tell me that I was the mistress in training that would never graduate because they wanted to keep me, they wanted to keep me there. And so they would always denigrate me and tear me down and be like, oh, you're not ready to graduate. You're not ready. Like they wouldn't let me graduate. And so it would like keep me in this perpetual state of training and telling me that any issue I had was like a flaw in mine. I'm like, oh, does anyone ever actually graduate or do people just leave harmed is a question that I have right now.
I think most people leave harmed, and the people who are still there don't graduate or are not like actually good doms, whatever really that means. Like what my assessment of what a good dom is, which involves skill and especially attunement and insight and like those types of things. Those things are missing. That they're not like marked, like they wouldn't be able to market themselves out of that context because people wouldn't go to them because the experiences that they give aren't that good. I also had to recontextualize my experience after leaving around labor because I had always been like, well, I was a pro dom for a hot minute, and I, experienced a lot of privilege within sex work as someone who it was always a side gig. I had never had to really rely on it for income. And like, I do think I had a lot of protective privilege and it allowed me to leave when I really had to because I didn't need it for money and wanted it more for the experience because it's something I loved to do. But then, several years later, and I think this is a conversation I had maybe like over a year ago with one of my current partners who, has worked as a pro dom, and they said, sometimes I was like, I don't know, like if I can even claim the label sex work all the time, like because of much of my privileged experience around it, that it was for a short time. There's a lot of ways that I didn't deal with a lot of stuff because of the context. And they were like, no, the context in which you did it though, like subjected you to a lot of abuse though. Like, and I just didn't really connect like my privilege as a sex worker to the pieces of that house that were actually really deprivileged, like removal of community, not actually giving us any kind of path to independence, removal of agency.
Intentionally not giving you a path to independence, like
Yeah.
hindering any opportunity you would have towards independence.
Yeah. And I think that like I forget those pieces of my experiences because I think in order for me to be able to really hold and process all of those experiences that happened to me, I have to sit in a place of gratitude for my experience and be like, I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have this. And I'm grateful for who I am, even if the experiences were bad. And I love who I am now. But it's hard because, again, as I was saying before, like I don't want people to take this message that like trauma is good for you because it's not.
No, but we're all traumatized. So
Exactly. Yeah, it's like
here's what you do.
the way that I have personally dealt with it and metabolized it into my nervous system is through a place of what can I do with my trauma now that it's happened. I can't go back. I can't heal from it in like this mystical magical way where like it's never happened. But I can take the pieces of it and grow in a way that feels really exciting and generative to me, and I can have this hopefulness and this excitement and a lust for life post this place, and take the skills that I want and leave the things that I don't.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I'm thinking of this one thing where it really started clicking for me because there are multiple things, like anytime you leave an abusive dynamic that happen, that like you start seeing patterns. And I
Mhm.
had probably been there for 4 or 5 years, and I
Mhm.
had my senior thesis photography show, and I invited them because I'm like, oh, master and mistress, people I'd
Mhm.
been in deep relationship with for 5 years, who've met my parent. When the headmistress before your mistress left, she stayed with me in my apartment in Brooklyn for 2 weeks and then stayed with my parents for 2 weeks, which was a very bizarre experience. I took a Pilates class with the woman who trained me and my mom, and Rihanna's S&M song played 3 times in this 1-hour class, and I'm just like, literally, you could not write this. This would be bad writing. But like, I remembered thinking about being like, oh, like you only care about me within this context of being able to control me and being outside. It was when it like really occurred to me how much of their power was based in never leaving the space that they created and
Yeah.
isolating you within it. And I was like, wow, you can't even take one afternoon to
Yeah.
drive 45 minutes. It like wasn't far, country
Yeah.
mile, to see this thing that I've been working on for the last like year and a half.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that is not the type of relationship that I thought that this was, where like you're interested in me as a person outside of just the way that you feel you can control me.
Yeah.
It wasn't just, I think also part of what I want to get across in this is that, so many of these dynamics could have taken place outside of a DS context and do in cult spaces that don't have this. Like when the Nexium thing happened, 5 people texted me being like, was this your upstate sex cult? And I'm like, no, different one. Mine was smaller. Mine's more niche. But like, I think so much of it depends on that isolation. And that was one moment that really hit home for me of like, they would not be able to maintain their power in my world because they created a space where their power is absolute. And it is like, right? Like if one of my favorite books is called like Love, Terror, and Brainwashing, like Love and Authoritarianism or something like that. And it talks about attachment theory and cult psychology and about how like from domestic violence to smaller cults to totalitarian states, it functions on destabilizing someone's attachment and creating not discordant, not secure, not, what's the word I'm looking for? Disorganized attachment. So like how these authoritarian systems, whether it be an abuser, whether it be a cult or like a fascist state, functions on ruining relationships and disorganizing your attachment to it. So you're both dependent on receiving love from and afraid of, and feel like you wouldn't exist without it. And I feel like they were such a small insular space at that one moment of stepping out, of asking them to step outside of this world that they created, would have brought it all crumbling down. And it sort of just like lifted the veil over the power that they held.
Totally. That makes sense. I think when we think a lot about attachment, that, you know, the push and pull of I want this, right? And like, how do I, as a therapist, I think a lot about developmentally authenticity versus attachment, right? When you're a child, many children choose to abandon themselves in service to attaching to their caregiver. And that's how you get people pleasers. And a very, reductive, it's complicated, but reductively, that's what happens. Right? Where many children choose to erase themselves, don't have boundaries. They do anything they can to appease their caregiver in order to maintain the attachment, because that's how they survive. That's how children need to survive. And then there's a small subset of folks who choose authenticity over attachment, and they have a lot of friction with their parents because of that. And I think in a lot of ways, I interestingly chose authenticity in the context of my childhood, and I was very, very, very rebellious. By rebellious, I mean I was a good kid, but my parents really, really like thought I was rebellious. And then as soon as I went to La Domaine, which by the way was less than a year, I was a freshman in college. It was less than a year since I moved out of my parents' house into college, and then I developed like an attachment to them where I was very willing to disregard my own boundaries. Decided, I don't think it was a choice, but went into this like, oh, my desires are shaped by their desires. It doesn't even matter what I want. What I want is what they want. I want to please them. And that's how they train you into that too.
It is. Even in my current style, you want what mommy wants. The only thing that brings you pleasure is what brings mommy pleasure. And I'm like, I'm super into it. And it's a super key part of my sexuality. It is highly seductive. People love it. And also, I think you can get lost in the sauce. But it's also like, if that's your kink, go with it. Like, I think you should just be able to talk about it. And there was never any space to talk about anything that was happening. It was not welcome. And in fact, it was
not welcome. And also, like, they choose people who weren't ready to talk about it. They hadn't processed that. Like, me now would never accept the things that happened back then, because I have boundaries now and I know how to advocate for myself. And I find that one of the key things that I help develop in my clients is being able to have boundaries and also identify their needs and their wants and then advocate for them. That's a key skill in kink and BDSM and also life. But La Domaine chose people who didn't have those skills. So I think the last kind of piece of that is, I think maybe definitely with me, but I also think that probably with you too, is like our temperaments, our nervous systems, our capacities to deal with fucked up things. I think we were able to hold all the things that were so fucked up there, right? I think a different nervous system, a different person who maybe has a different experiences or different traumas could have been more seriously hurt by the things that happened there. I have had a completely...
I mean, they were.
Yeah, like there are folks who were very, very seriously harmed. And I know that I was seriously harmed, but I don't contextualize it that way in my memory as much, because I don't think I can, because I feel so grateful for it too.
Well, I think it's so, right. It is something that's so complicated and I don't quite have language for, but like, I also have gratitude for this space that harmed me. And I think it also, I do think it goes, I don't know. I do think it goes back to like theories of abolition and like things not being completely good or bad. Like it definitely wasn't a good place, but good came out of it. Like I know you know that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think the more we are able to hold the complexities of our experience, the more reflective they are of reality. You know, like the master that we're talking about is an incredibly skilled folk musician who would like play amazing music for us and like cook beautiful meals for us all the time, and like was like a very deeply, I think deeply interesting person, and like one of the most manipulative people I've ever met in my
Yeah.
life.
And it can be both.
And he can be both.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is like I think we both have the capacity in our
Yeah.
nervous systems for nuance, which in my brain is a very important skill when it comes to interacting with your trauma. I don't think that this is necessarily the goal for everyone, right? Like not everybody can do nuance in that way or are able to do nuance, but like when we are able to hold all of the different realities that are a thing, like this was bad and I got these good things out of it, like that is for me how I've been able to move on and survive through this. That's not going to be the solution for every single person. I have a lot of clients who that's just not possible, and also maybe isn't the right thing for
Yeah.
them. But for me personally, my favorite cheese is the cheese that he showed me, right? Like he was like, "This is such a great cheese," and I'm like, "Oh God, I love this cheese." And I'm immediately thinking about him every single time I eat this cheese, which is fucked up. And I hope he never listens to this because I don't want him to. I don't want him to know that. But if he ends up knowing that, that's okay. I can be vulnerable and be like,
I still
"You
like
hurt me really bad, and you gave me my favorite cheese."
that. He gave me my love of folk music and like session with murder ballads, and like
Yeah.
I think that's something I think about a lot. I was like going through before the call, I was going through some of our emails looking for some, and there were some really fucked up ones. And then there were also a lot about like folk music and stuff. And I think like when we are harmed, uh, it's so complicated to talk about. I still feel like we're developing the lexicon to talk about how complex abuses of power are, because
Mhm.
like I think there are, right, even as a 19-year-old, you had some power. I feel, at least I'll speak for myself, even as a 19-year-old, like in this situation with very little life experience, I actually didn't know the language for BDSM. I dressed as a dominatrix when I was 16, but like I didn't have enough knowledge to like search for BDSM related pornography when I found Law Domain. I just like found the one clip that, yeah.
That's so interesting because I had the knowledge to
Uh,
search for BDSM pornography since I was like 7 and was telling my 8th grade classmates that I was a masochist and defining it for people.
Amazing.
Yeah. So that
I
was
I think because I was very interested in the psychology. So I was in 7th grade in a chat room teasing, denying someone and being like, I'm a hot 18-year-old girl with big like tits and blue eyes and blonde hair. And then as soon as they're about to come, I'm like, just kidding, I'm an old man in my mom's basement. And I would sign off of AOL and then I'd go jerk off. You know, like and I'm like, I just didn't have search terms for that, you know? It was because it was always about power for me. It wasn't about specific activity or even, I am a sadomasochist, but I think I came to that a little bit later.
um,
I wasn't interested. I guess I probably saw it. I definitely saw a bunch of gay leather stuff because of family. And I was at Pride once and saw them, and my gay uncles were like, we're not all like that. And I'm like, I want to go be where the leather daddies are. Like, take me to they gave me candy. I loved them. I was like 10, and it's such a core memory for me. And yeah, I don't know. I think we're missing some language when we talk about harm and like as these totalizing spaces. And I think there are instances where like one really doesn't have power or agency, and there are instances where people do have some. And I feel still quite conflicted about my experience because, you know, like I don't know, I was very excitedly showing up every other weekend, and it took me a long time to realize that a lot of the things that were happening weren't okay and weren't just my experience and like wasn't a flaw in myself as someone who was trying to learn from someone who like presents themselves as an expert, and in many ways is an expert, but like in specific in like manipulation, you know?
Totally. Yeah. I think we don't really have the language yet, but I do feel like this conversation has like helped me like focus my framework around it too. Like I feel like language is budding around it, or like maybe I won't ever really be able to describe it because I don't think like English can really encapsulate our experience properly. I mean, like when I think about Avgi's book, like there's so much about that is encapsulated in her language, which is
Yeah.
incredibly like amazing that she was able to do that. But it's like a 250-page book that like people still have questions about because so much of it is unknowable and like intelligible to language. And that I think is also why we're having a hard time describing all the
Yeah.
things
Well, so it's
about.
like in summary, you never really know yourself. Everyone's traumatized and have complicated relationships with their trauma and with people who have abused power over them.
Yeah, and totally. And I think also like one thing that I want to also get across is that it's okay to have that complicated dynamic. It's okay, like it's not like a moral misgiving to eroticize the trauma in your life. And that can be actually an important tool for people. I think that the line between eroticizing your trauma in a generative way and in like a reenacting trauma in a bad way is there's a line there, but it can feel a little bit like a fine line, and it can be hard to
It's interesting too because
distinguish.
I've like in Avi's writing and in speaking with her a bit, like this, she writes a lot about repetition and like I don't know enough about psychoanalysis, but like Laplanchian ideas of like repetition is something that she writes a lot about, and you know, like talking with her and reading her work has made me rethink of like, you know, that there's not necessarily even this binary between like harmful repetition and not harmful because it's doing something for you, right? And if we're focusing on the question of like, what are you doing with your trauma? And if you are seeking out the same thing over and over again, I think one thing you need to do is take accountability for the harm, like get that awareness of what you are seeking out, because I don't know, I've been in situations where I feel like people have used me as a dom to replay their trauma that I knew nothing
Yeah.
about, and I felt horribly after because they were clearly harmed, but like I had no idea that that was happening because that wasn't my intention. And so but like, you know, I think, you know, and like I can speak for myself when I like seek things out. I guess I don't have that repetitive thing, but I think even if it is causing harm, it is doing something generative. It just might be like degenerative first
Yeah.
because like you are moving through something. And I think what I take from her work and from performance studies is that each time you do it, it is slightly different. Like her talk about becoming overwhelmed by the play, slave play. Each time she saw the performance, she like got something else out of it and was moved in a different way. And she talks about her own experience of like overwhelm with becoming like enamored and obsessed with this play as one instance of that like seeking of repetition. And right, like you can be watching the same play over and over again, but the performance, the seeking out of that same experience is going to be different every time you do it. So like, and this is a question I've had before of like, when clients come to me to clearly replay a trauma, who are like, know that they're like, this happened to me in my childhood. This is the specific session that I want. Like, it's pretty scripted and, you know, like there's not a lot of deviation, but even in that space of performance and embodiment, there is space for movement, even if like it looks like someone just seeking out replaying their trauma. And so I think it is much less of this binary between, I mean, I think everything we're talking about is like, it's less of a binary between like seeking out replaying your trauma in a negative way or a generative way, because we're all seeking movement. We're all seeking newness. And even if we aren't able to get to that new, like seemingly generative end, there is that like impulse and that drive. And I think that repetitive drive does bring people somewhere, even if you can't see it at the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the benefits and the the cost benefit analysis is where like I work with in therapy clients, right? Because like I think that, you know, the possibility of like going to a provider and replaying your exact trauma like, with a script, like that could be considered reenacting your trauma, or it could be like that could be different than the repetition compulsion versus like inciting traumatisms, if we're going to use Off-Key's language and like have that dichotomy that doesn't actually exist, right? I think the difference is like, is this like degrading your life or becoming debilitating in some ways? Are you like losing connection? Are you betraying yourself? Is it making it harder for you to have boundaries? Those are the questions I ask my clients, not the actual content of like whether or not they like replayed word for word their trauma, but mostly they can do that, but like, and then what?
I think all like, yes, I totally hear what you're saying. I think we're saying the same thing. I think part of what I'm also trying to say is that even if it is causing those issues that would cause someone to seek out therapy, I think it's doing something.
Yeah,
You know,
it's doing a
and like
thing.
it might, right? Just like, you know, every action we do is doing something, you know, like choosing not
Yeah,
to do something is doing something as well.
yeah. Which is, yeah, that's why I come from like a very like, what's the function kind of perspective with
Yeah.
therapy. Why do we self-harm? Why are you doing that? What's the function? Of course, I don't want my clients to self-harm, obviously, but we're looking at the function instead of demonizing the action of self-harm.
Yes.
And even if we can conceptualize some certain sexual acts as self-harm versus not self-harm, right? Like I'm way more interested on how are we playing these things out than I am about like, you know, stopping behavior that is deemed bad for you or unhealthy. When my
Right.
clients are like, is this healthy or unhealthy? I don't give them an answer. Also, my clients hate it when I don't give them an answer because I never do. But like,
Warms your little sadist heart.
yeah, my little sadist heart is like, the reality of that is because I don't have an answer.
You
Mostly
can't
one,
answer
because
yourself.
yeah, I can't answer that for somebody else. And it's so nuanced.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I feel like I could and will continue talking to you about this for a long time. But I feel
Totally.
like we covered so much. I'm curious if you have, like, as we wrap up the conversation, do you have any like closing thoughts, or is there anything else you would want to share? And if you are interested in people contacting you or finding you or as resources, is there anything you want to?
Yeah, totally. I love this conversation. I'm super down to continue having it all the time. Love to talk to other people about it too. Um, I am constantly full, so nobody can really contact me to be my client because I don't have a space for that anymore, unfortunately. Which maybe is like okay, right? But like I love to talk to people about these concepts and also particularly other therapists. I'm always looking for other kinky therapist community. If those folks want to reach out to me and we can chat, I'm so down to make time for that all the time. I don't know. I guess the best place to reach out to me would be like through Instagram, I guess. I don't know. My Instagram is at faggy.figgy. So yeah. So you can come find me on that or something and reach out to me or whatever. And I think I don't remember the rest of your question.
Oh, if there's just anything else you wanted to add about to wrap up the conversation.
Maybe that this is a continuing conversation, that there's so much here and there's so much that's unarticulatable. And like, I am certainly not an expert in a lot of things, including and especially my clients' lives and other people's lives. So like my experience, I'm probably an expert in only my experience. And the way that I contextualize trauma for myself is not the way that works for everybody. But I think there are a lot of interesting lessons that I've given to myself through processing my relationship to trauma and eroticism. And it's been a real gift for me to be able to eroticize my experiences in this way, in lots of fucked up ways that we didn't even touch in this conversation, right? So like I don't want people to listen to this and think that either I'm the goal for trauma healing or processing, because that's certainly not true. I've got a lot of fucked up problems also. But that there is always room to grow in your personal direction and find a place that feels good for you individually, and like go work with a kinky therapist about it.
Yeah. I think Manhattan Alternative, I want to shout out as a great resource for finding kink-aware therapists. I actually have on my blog a form of how to reach out to a kink-aware therapist and important things to put in to like vet people if you're unable to find people in insurance, and like what questions to ask providers to see if they'll be able to provide you with competent care. And yeah, I want to second that. Like I also feel like it's important to iterate. We're still working through, like, we will always be, at least I'll speak for myself, like I will always be working through what that like very formative sexual experience has done to me and how it has shaped me and how I understand it. And it is impacted. I think this feels important. Like even the conversations we've had have impacted my understanding of that experience. And I think that is part of like so much of the harm that we experience is that isolation, is that like I never would have thought to reach out to you, you know? Like it
Me too.
wouldn't have occurred to me, and I wouldn't have known how, because
Me
they
neither.
want us to do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like I've thought about you a lot over the past like
Yeah.
literally 6 years since I left this house. And when I saw you, I almost didn't reach out. I almost didn't say hi, you know, because I was nervous and scared and also unsure if you would, one, even recognize me, or two, find me an important person to even bother to connect to. And what I found was that we've got all of these overlapping experiences that are, it's been really, really generative to talk to you about. And like I would love to just like continue that connection because I'm feeling really drawn to this part of my life.
To the
But
wound.
yeah, the wound. I'm drawn to the wound.
Together.
And I love being able to process that together because the other people in my life who I met through that space do not all of them have the capacity to really confront all of that in the way that I would
It's a
like to.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like, right, that goes to like everyone's journey, I think, is different. And everyone's like, I don't even want to say capacity. It's just like everyone integrates their own experiences of harm differently. And that is their right to integrate them in a way that allows them to move through life with the most ease and comfort that they're able to find.
Wow.
But yeah, for me, I think because of how isolated it was, and you know, even just like outside of this specific house, I don't know anyone else who trained the way that I did. I don't know, like I don't know if I know anyone outside of the house that we trained at that has a similar or comparable experience. Not even like specifically with the harm that we experienced, but like Old Guard is just very unusual, you know, and it's like it's often very underground. People don't talk about it a lot if it is happening, and a lot of it has sort of like evolved, like dissolved, I think, as you know, like different consent practices came up in kink community and different conversations were happening. And there is, I say like on my website that a lot of what I learned about power is through seeing the misuse of it, which I stand by. And I also, there's like a lot that I miss about some of the Old Guard things. And I think it's a constantly like iterative process of like figuring out with partners and communities, like how to keep some of that history and some of that like beauty and that depth and devotion that is possible to cultivate, and that it is not necessary to harm people in the pursuit of that depth and ligation of a world that like doesn't just serve you but serves the community and a function for like fucking perverted leather freaks who need like beautiful space to be perverted in, you know, like going to a space every weekend in college to hang out with fucking like deranged people in the most like lovely way was like literally life altering. And like, you know, kink parties to me in the city don't quite feel the same. But like the family dynamic was so integral to my sexuality, and something that I seek to cultivate is like depth of leather dynamics and leather family in a way that I see some people doing it, you know, but I think when some people talk about leather family, it feels different than how I was raised.
Wow.
And also because I'm like, my leather family is more fucked up than my bio family. Like, how did I get into this situation?
I know.
And like, and for me, like my far away leather family who like I don't speak to anyone in it, and my estranged leather family like is estranged and I'm like not estranged from my bio family, so it's like it operates slightly differently for me than I think for like a lot of queer people too.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It does feel like I was raised in this house and I'm estranged from them, which is for me a very familiar experience because I'm estranged from my parents, which interestingly, I'm working my way back into low contact in ways, which is so interesting. Thinking about the place where I am in my life, thinking about my past and the places I can credit to being raised and where I grew up, to have this returning back to thinking about my experiences in this house is really interesting. And I think I keep seeking some parts of it that I really miss and love in like the New York City leather queer community. And it's not the same. Like, even things that like IMSO, like for some of my partners, awoken a level of DS exploration and leather exploration and this deep, interesting connection that they had never witnessed before, but for me felt so familiar, and I part of me that left wanting more, right?
Same.
Because I understand the deep vastness of it that I think old guard can do, and also the deep vast harm that old guard can do. So it's like it's complicated, but I think there's been a desire for me for a really long time to explore the ways that I was raised again and somehow find the parts of it that I really miss and love and like recreate that. Speaking of reenactment, like,
Yeah.
you know,
Ideally we'll do it the generative, but who knows though. uh I love that. I think that's like a lovely place to wrap up the conversation. It's like what can we take from that history?
Yeah.
And like what do we do with that trauma? Which part of it sounds like how do we iterate off of the really beautiful components of how we were raised. So fucked up to use it, but it's so I like no other language feels correct to me. Like I find myself saying it and I like have to clarify for people what I'm talking about. Like when I was growing up, I like am often talking about in a leather household.
Yeah.
But yeah, like what do we take? What do we leave behind? Like how do we honor these traditions and like move them into a space that like, you know, is a fucking abolitionist, you know, and is not a like iteration of a fascist state, you know, like how do we play? Maybe this is what we can talk about next time because I know this has been very long, but like how do we create this abolitionist kink world that eroticizes all of these like deeply fascist totalitarian elements of power and control in a way where we are accountable to each other and have capacity not just for like repair, because I don't think you always need like I don't think well I guess repair isn't like the intention to remain in relationship with people, but the intention to, you know, have space for people to fuck up, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's an important clarification. I need you and everyone else listening to this to know how hard my dick just got when you just talked about that suggestion. I'm obsessed with that topic, and like I think that's a great place. Leave everyone wanting more.
Perfect. I want more, but so I'm gonna edge myself and I'm gonna end right here. Oh, and if anyone wants to find me, you can Google Mistress Blunt. And if you want to be brainwashed me with the brainwashing techniques that I have studied with my reading and in my lived experience, feel free.